Between higher standards in education and fierce competition for the best opportunities, students from many backgrounds are more vulnerable to stress, anxiety, and depression. That's confirmed in a recent national survey that shows significantly more college students trying to get treatment for mental health concerns. The trend was recently explored in a series of reports by WGBH Radio, Stressed and Depressed on Campus. We'd like to welcome its reporter, Kirk Carapezza. Thank you very much for being with us, Kirk.
Hey, Chris. Good to be here.
Kirk, a lot of people are aware of these two book-ending sensational stories, one involving the suicide, the other being the college admissions scandal. But what about this trend in between? What's going on?
Right. When you hear about this issue on campus, a lot of the focus is on suicides, right? It's usually the most sensational. That's the extreme. That's the worst-case scenario. With this series, we really wanted to focus on anxiety and depression. And anecdotally, I've heard from friends who teach at some of these schools around here that they're seeing this in their students. They're finding they're more anxious and more depressed than they've ever seen before. And after our series aired, I got a number of text messages and emails from friends who teach in the schools here, and they said, I'm seeing this in the classroom. So with this series, we wanted to, this is a young people's problem. I think that first and foremost, this is not just an issue on our college campuses, but the research shows that this is now widespread on college campuses. And we commissioned a poll on this back in 2017, and we asked about 1,000 Americans what they think about a number of issues in higher ed. And on mental health, most Americans don't think colleges are doing a good job looking after students' mental health. So that was kind of the impetus for doing this series. And then we've been collecting information and talking to sources for a couple of years now. And this research coming out of Boston University and the University of Michigan that finds anxiety and depression rates have doubled in the last 10 years became kind of the headline for our series, Stressed and Depressed on Campus.
Now, is this just the students and just the campuses, or is there something bigger happening here, some kind of big sort scenario?
Yeah, everyone wants to know, what's driving this, and no one knows the one source. I think it depends who you ask. The three things that kept coming up were the political and social climate. We're living in a time where a lot of students are constantly bombarded by the news, by apocalyptic headlines. If you read the latest reports coming out of the UN, they're not very rosy. I've talked to psychologists who talk about this idea of eco-anxiety. Students are worried that the climate's changing, the world's going to come to an end. There's also, but the political climate isn't necessarily new. The two other reasons, I think, it kind of signifies what's changed. I think social media, the fact that these students are constantly on and they're constantly trying to put their best face forward all the time, or try to see what other students are doing, and to get into that most selective school and then post about it on Facebook. That's increasing anxiety. And then the colleges themselves. Colleges, all the administrators we spoke with said that they're trying to solve this. And some, they wouldn't admit this on tape, but some would say on background that they do worry they're contributing to the problem with increased cost and admission standards, high admission standards, that's driving anxiety and depression among students too.
You can talk about what you see at these colleges is the end of a pipeline that begins, I was going to say at an early age, but as you reported in your series here, this is not just about an early age, this is before the early age.
Right. This is what shocked me, and I think shocked a lot of our listeners. We spoke with a psychologist in Concord. His name's David Gleason. He wrote a book called At What Cost? Defending Adolescent Development at Highly Competitive Schools. And he kept telling me, Kirk, these issues start earlier than you think. And in certain communities, our most affluent communities, which tend to be white and Asian, you have families securing spots at daycare centers before their kids are conceived. And we featured a young family in Groton, Massachusetts, Rachel and Mike Leary. And Rachel herself is a child psychologist, and she was 5 months pregnant. She thought she was ahead of the game. And so she picks up the phone and starts calling around, and she can't find a place. All the spots are taken, and she starts doing some research, and she finds out they're being held for kids who haven't been conceived yet, for siblings of kids who haven't been conceived yet. And so she widens her search outside Groton and finds there's a daycare center that's advertising STEM education, where toddlers are walking around wearing lab coats as if they're working in an MIT Media Lab. And she starts thinking, this is nuts. I'm a child psychologist. I know the kind of development that my son will need. I just want someone to play with him and teach him how to share.
Now, on the other hand, there is another body of research that points at problems among black students
Right.
in early grades. What's going on?
Right. So among those students, we featured another family in Dorchester, and a young boy named Jeremiah who's going to school in BPS, and his mom Maria Santos said he was happy-go-lucky kid growing up. She sends him to school in Dorchester, the Murphy School, and he comes back and he's sad every day. And she says, "What's going on?" And he said, "I'm not making any friends." And so after a month, she goes in to find out why. And it turns out the school had placed him in an ESL class. And the school claims that she had checked a box somewhere that said he spoke another language at home, he's fluent in English. And so with these students, Black and Latino students in our poorer districts, whether it's real discrimination or perceived discrimination, that can affect their physical and mental well-being. And the researchers we spoke with at Harvard said that leads to increased levels of fear, increased levels of hopelessness. There's this low perceived economic opportunity, and that's showing up on campus. So those students are showing up on campus with the same problems caused by very different reasons.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Kirk Carapezza from WGBH News. Kirk, one of the students you interviewed was somebody who was a star athlete in high school. She went to an elite college, and then there was a problem. Tell us about her.
Yeah, Allie Gold was one of the students from Medfield High School who we featured in part 2 of our series, and she kind of represents the high-achieving student from one of the affluent suburbs. And from the outside, you meet Allie, you meet her today, and she's smiling, bubbly. From the outside, she seemed like she had everything together. She had everything going for her. She played 3 varsity sports in high school. She won 4 state championships. Mike Lynch and Channel 5 featured her on the local news. But then she told me months later, after the soccer season would ended, she would drop into this deep depression, and she was cutting herself. And she said no one would know. She was able to keep it from most of her friends, and she was able to continue to get perfect scores and get into an elite 4-year private school, but there was this drive to be perfect. And she told me, there's this quote in one of the pieces in her feature where she says, "I got 100 on my test when she was a freshman at sophomore college," and she said, "I still didn't think I did enough." And she said everything in her room needed to be color coded, and she was diagnosed with a number of disorders, bipolar disorder, and she eventually sought help, and she was able to recover. She transferred here. She took some time off before transferring here to BU. She's now a senior, and she's set to graduate in May, but she's now working at a local hospital here, working with teenagers like her who needed this help. But that when I talk to psychologists, they say we're seeing more and more of those cases where a generation ago, these students were stressed and they were depressed and they might have eating disorders, but now they're cutting themselves, and in the worst cases, they're attempting to take their own lives.
So what are the universities doing?
Yeah, no one has this figured out. And in part 4, we featured NYU as one example of a school that has tried to respond to this. NYU saw a number of suicides. I think it was 6 students took their own lives within a 12-month period back in 2003, 2004, and they described that as a contagion on campus. Students were committing suicide in a very public way on campus. And so what they did was they set up a hotline, and they set up a suicide hotline, and now every single incoming freshman at NYU watches a musical called The Reality Show that advertises that suicide hotline. So when you and I went to college, they might have been, advertising the pep rally or the band that's going to come to campus. Now they have the suicide hotline number posted on the back of their ID cards. But schools, no one has this figured out. The one key takeaway I think from this series is that there's no way to hire enough counselors. The demand is so high, and only 40% of young people who have a diagnosable mental health problem actually seek help, but the stigma is lessening and the demand keeps increasing. And so colleges like BU are telling me they can't hire enough counselors to keep up with the demand. So some of the solutions that people are discussing are group therapy, having students get together and share their own stories, putting it on the syllabus, having faculty talk about this, or at least bake it into the curriculum. Georgetown University got a grant, and they're using funds now where you could be in the middle of a classics course and studying the Iliad, and the professor will say, "Hey, it looks like Ulysses might be having a mental health crisis here. Let's bring in a psychologist to talk this through." And that's one way of just kind of baking it in, because the students I don't know about you, but when I was in college, I procrastinated all the time, especially big assignments. So this is one of those. The psychologists tell me that students who have real issues with mental health are very likely to procrastinate and not to seek help, but they're required to be in class. So if you can reach them where they are, that's one way that we might stem this problem.
One thing in your story they found both disturbing and a bit puzzling is that despite all of the inclusiveness in the culture of universities, both in theory and in practice, the isolation is still there. You profiled one LGBTQ student at MIT. Tell me about him.
Right. Tanner Bonner is a 19-year-old from Metro Detroit. He's from Dearborn Heights. He grew up poor. He was working full-time while he's in high school to support his family. His mom's unemployed, and his dad is on disability, and he scored a perfect score on the ACT. He won a prestigious national scholarship to get a full ride, and then he was accepted to MIT. He told me he'd never heard of MIT. He thought it was when he told people he got in his hometown, they thought it was the Michigan Institute of Technology. He shows up on campus, and he kind of describes to me these two worlds that are constantly separate. And as a first-generation student, as the first in his family to go to college, and as a poor student, he's always comparing himself to other students, and he already suffered from anxiety, and I think his experience at MIT has only increased his anxiety. He's also sought help. He's seeing a psychiatrist, and he's used some of their student resources, but he kind of represents those students who one expert referred to them as levitators. These students who are so talented, but then they find themselves in these super elite environments, and they don't know how to navigate their way through. And these students need a different kind of help. So MIT, again, they won't say they figured this out, but they have made efforts. They've set up some first-generation programs where faculty, students, and alumni can get together and talk about their experiences and share what's happened. And Tanner says that his anxiety is under control. He's able to control it, but he's also, in addition to being a first-generation low-income student, he's also gay. Even in a community like Cambridge, he told me that he still feels isolated, that can lead to increased social isolation, because while Cambridge is a very welcoming community, he sees flashes of intolerance at home, online, in Washington. He told me he worries about President Trump adding conservative Supreme Court justices that might undermine gay rights. So all of these stories are so complicated, and when you report on mental health, this has been one of the hardest things to write about, because, as you know, human stories are just so complicated, and to distill them down, to 3, 4. I mean, GBH was generous; they gave me 7 minutes for each story. But even then, so much gets left out, and you can't. Everyone's so complicated. But we hope that these stories represent the challenges facing these students and how colleges are responding.
Well, I know you've got the sound clips still up and some more details in writing as well. So how can people access that?
Sure. So we have a podcast. It's called On Campus Radio. You can download that wherever you get your podcast. And then you can go to WGBHnews.org and click on the education link, or go to the On Campus page, and you can find all of our series there.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Chris.
Kirk Carapezza from WGBH News. In a moment, we'll hear about new efforts to help businesses headed by women and people of color. But first, this message.